crowded courtroom. Silence thickened as realization dawned on everyone present. Officer Mitchell's rigid stance faltered as whispers turned into a low murmur of disbelief. The very man she had aggressively dragged before the court was a symbol of strength, justice, and discipline, a name synonymous with law enforcement itself. The judge, still gripping his gavel, seemed torn between reprimanding her and acknowledging the absurdity of the situation. The suspect, now revealed as a legend, remained composed, his gaze steady but unreadable. For the first time in her career, Mitchell felt the weight of judgment shift onto her. The uneasy glances from the jury, the hesitant movements of the clerks, and the quiet scrutiny of her colleagues sent a clear message. This wasn't just an error. It was a public spectacle of mistaken identity, driven by assumptions rather than facts. She had acted on instinct, but instincts, she now realized, could be flawed, especially when shaped by bias rather than reason. The words "resisting arrest" echoed in her mind, making her stomach churn. He hadn't resisted, he had simply refused to react to her aggression. The judge exhaled slowly, setting his gavel down without a word. The weight of her misstep settled like lead in her chest. This wasn't just about one arrest gone wrong, it was about the deep-seated issues that had led her to see a man as a suspect before she saw him as a person. As Chuck Norris stood in quiet dignity, the courtroom waited. The moment stretched, heavy with the unspoken conversation that had just unfolded. And in that silence, Mitchell understood. This wasn't just about her mistake, it was about a system that had allowed it to happen. Could still see the lines of age and wisdom etched into his features. His calmness unsettled her. Years of training told her that true criminals often tried too hard to appear innocent. Something about him felt off. Too much control, too much discipline. To her, that meant danger. The man moved deliberately, retrieving his license with the kind of precision she associated with law enforcement or the military. The name on the card barely registered in her mind as her suspicion deepened. She gestured for him to step out of the vehicle. The way he obeyed, smooth and composed, only fueled her doubts. People with nothing to hide still showed some level of nervousness. He didn't. Mitchell ordered him to place his hands on the hood. As she reached for her cuffs, her instincts screamed that something wasn't right, but she had long since learned to trust them. The moment she clasped the cold metal around his wrists, the man finally spoke. His voice was steady, measured. "Officer, are you sure about this?" The way he said it sent a chill through her, but she ignored it, ignored the gnawing feeling in her gut, ignored the subtle recognition itching at the back of her mind. She had made up her mind. He was a threat. She radioed in the arrest and shoved him into the back of her cruiser. The drive to the courthouse was silent, but the weight of the moment lingered in the air. It wasn't until she dragged him into the courtroom, past gasps and stares of horror, that the truth hit her like a freight train. She hadn't just arrested some troublemaker on the road. She had arrested a legend. Rear Window. The subtle hint that this man was not just anyone. The way he moved, the effortless control in his posture, should have told her everything. But Mitchell was too caught up in proving herself, too deep in her assumptions to see the truth unfolding before her. The cuffs clicked shut, and she forced him toward her cruiser, ignoring the murmurs around her. It wasn't until the courthouse doors swung open, revealing Judge Martinez's stunned expression, that the reality of her mistake began to sink in. The air in the courtroom felt thick with tension. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into gasps. Phones captured every second, ensuring the moment would spread far beyond these walls. Mitchell turned, looking at the man she had so aggressively detained. The way he carried himself, the quiet dignity in his stance, the unwavering steadiness of his gaze. It all came crashing down on her. The calmness that had irritated her, the authority in his voice that had set her teeth on edge, suddenly made sense. She hadn't arrested just anyone. She had arrested a symbol of discipline and strength, a name revered across Texas. The judge exhaled sharply, placing his gavel down with deliberate slowness. The courtroom held its breath. The moment stretched unbearably, every eye locked on her. The realization clawed at her chest. This wasn't just a wrongful arrest. This was a career-ending mistake, one built on the very biases she had sworn to rise above, to say something. The courtroom held its breath as all eyes turned to him. Even Mitchell, still clutching her notepad, felt her pulse quicken. His calm authority had irritated her before, but now it commanded the room in a way she couldn't deny. Chuck Norris didn't raise his voice, yet every word cut through the air with precision. "This isn't about me," he said, his gaze steady. "This is about a system that too often judges before it listens, acts before it understands. I may walk free today, but how many others aren't given that chance?" His words struck deeper than any reprimand. Mitchell felt the weight of them pressing against her chest, heavier than the badge pinned to her uniform. She had prided herself on instinct, on experience, on knowing the difference between right and wrong. But today, she had been wrong. And not just about him, about everything that had led her to this moment. The judge nodded solemnly. The courtroom remained silent, but the message was clear. Phones were still recording, reporters still scribbling. This moment wouldn't just disappear. Mitchell swallowed hard, her fingers loosening around her notepad. There was no justification, no excuse. The consequences of her mistake were already unfolding, and for the first time in her career, she had nothing to say. Fully. His gaze was steady, unwavering, not angry, not vengeful, just deeply knowing. Mitchell felt exposed in a way she never had before. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her, not because of the cameras, not because of the courtroom's hushed silence, but because she had failed in the very duty she had sworn to uphold. Chuck Norris didn't gloat, didn't admonish her with words sharper than the ones he had already spoken. Instead, he simply studied her, letting the gravity of the moment sink in. The judge cleared his throat, bringing the room back to reality. "Mr. Norris, you are free to go," he declared, but the words felt almost unnecessary. Mitchell took a step back as Norris turned toward the exit. The courtroom doors swung open, and as he stepped through them, the whispers started again. The phones still capturing every second. But it was the silence he left behind that echoed the loudest. For the first time in her career, Mitchell didn't feel powerful. She didn't feel in control. She only felt the crushing realization of how easily power could be misused, not just by her, but by the system she had placed her faith in. And as she stood there, her badge suddenly felt heavier than ever before. Not to fight. His words hung in the air, heavier than any physical blow. Mitchell felt the weight of them settle deep in her chest. He wasn't mocking her, wasn't berating her. He was teaching her. She had spent her career believing in authority, in control, in the certainty that her instincts were always right. But today those instincts had failed her. She had acted out of suspicion, not reason, out of force, not wisdom. And now, standing before a man who had built his legacy on discipline and restraint, she saw herself through his eyes. Norris took a step closer, not as an opponent, but as a teacher. "Real strength," he continued, "isn't about how fast you draw your weapon or how hard you can take someone down. It's about knowing when to step back, when to listen, when to see past your own assumptions." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Mitchell wanted to defend herself, to say something, anything, but there was nothing to say. She had let her fear and pride dictate her actions. And today, in front of a judge, a legend, and a world that was still watching, she was finally seeing the truth. Judge Martinez cleared his throat, breaking the silence. I believe that's enough for today." His voice was firm but not unkind. "Mr. Norris, you're free to go." Norris gave Mitchell one last look, not one of anger but of understanding. Then he turned and walked away, his presence just as powerful in stillness as it was in motion. As the courtroom doors swung shut behind him, Mitchell remained frozen, her badge feeling heavier than ever. Today, she hadn't just learned a lesson, she had faced a truth she could never ignore again, fell into stunned silence. No one had expected this. Not a demand for punishment, but an offer of redemption. Mitchell felt the weight of the moment, pressing down on her, heavier than any disciplinary action could have been. "1 week," Norris continued, his voice steady. "Come train at my ranch. Learn what real strength looks like." His gaze never wavered. "Learn what it truly means to serve." Mitchell's breath caught. The courtroom, the cameras, the murmurs, they all seemed distant now. This wasn't just about saving her career. This was about facing the truth she had ignored for too long. Judge Martinez studied her, then spoke. "Officer Mitchell, this is your decision." She looked at Norris, then down at the badge on her chest. It wasn't a shield, it wasn't power. It was a responsibility, one she had lost sight of. Swallowing hard, she nodded. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm willing to learn." A slow smile crossed Norris's face, not one of victory, but of recognition. She had taken the first step. The judge's gavel came down, but Mitchell knew the real lesson had just begun. He said, his voice steady but not unkind. Mitchell hesitated before stepping out of the car, feeling exposed without her usual authority. Here, she was not Officer Mitchell. She was just Karen, a student like everyone else. The ranch was alive with movement. Young students practiced drills with unwavering focus, their discipline evident in every motion. Older trainees worked in pairs, their respect for each other clear in the way they moved. No arrogance, no aggression, just control. It was a stark contrast to the way she had approached her job for years. Norris stepped closer, studying her, carefully. "Strength isn't about control over others," he said. "It's about control over yourself." Mitchell swallowed, her throat dry. She had spent her career believing that authority came from force, from never showing weakness. But looking around, she saw something different. These students didn't fear Norris. They respected him. Not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. "Come inside," he said, turning toward the training hall. "Your first lesson starts now." Mitchell took a deep breath and followed. For the first time in years, she wasn't giving orders. She was listening, without the weight of her uniform. She had always believed that authority came from the badge, but now, standing among students who had faced struggles far different from her own, she began to question that belief. Chuck gestured for her to step onto the mat, where a young girl stood waiting. "This is Maya," he said. "She's 14. Show me how you'd handle an aggressor her size." Mitchell hesitated before assuming a defensive stance. The girl moved with precision, her speed catching Mitchell off guard. Within seconds, Mitchell found herself on the ground, breathless. The room remained silent as Norris extended a hand to help her up. "You relied on force," he said. "She relied on skill." Mitchell rubbed her sore shoulder, humbled in a way she had never been before. "All your life, you've worn that badge like armor," Norris continued. "But real strength isn't about power over others. It's about knowing when to step back, when to listen." Mitchell looked around at the students, at the boy she once saw as nothing but trouble, at Maya, who had just taught her a lesson without saying a word. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a cop. She felt like someone who had a lot to learn. Techniques. It would change the way she saw the world. Day after day, she trained alongside kids she once dismissed as troublemakers. She learned not just how to subdue, but how to diffuse, how to see beyond actions to understand intent. She felt the shift in herself, the way her instincts softened from confrontation to connection. By the end of the week, Mitchell wasn't just moving differently. She was thinking differently. Standing in front of Chuck Norris on her final day, she realized she hadn't just learned how to fight. She had learned how not to. "Ready to take this back to the force?" he asked. She nodded. But not just as a cop, as a better person. Karen Mitchell woke up early, the memories of yesterday's training still fresh in her mind. The lone Wolf franchise dojo was silent in the early dawn, but inside her, a storm raged. The lessons on the mat had been humbling, her body aching in ways she hadn't expected. Chuck's controlled moves had been precise, not violent, but they had stripped away her confidence layer by layer. She wasn't used to feeling vulnerable. At exactly 5 a.m., she joined the other students in the dojo, the air thick with anticipation. Chuck stood calmly in the center, his voice steady as he introduced the day's lesson: power and control. Karen's heart tightened as she saw Marcus Thompson walking toward her. Just a few months ago, she had arrested him for loitering. Now, they stood as equals on the mat, the past lingering between them. The look in Marcus's eyes held something unreadable, a quiet defiance, perhaps even curiosity. He nodded, acknowledging her. For a moment, she hesitated before responding. Titles didn't matter here. She wasn't Officer Mitchell right now, just Karen. Karen stood in the dojo, remembering Chuck's words as his voice echoed through the space. The strongest person in each pair would throw the first punch. She knew that by all measures, size, training, and experience, she was stronger, but something about Marcus's stance made her hesitate. He wasn't the same kid she had, arrested months ago. There was confidence in the way he stood, a quiet readiness. She moved first, her jab controlled and precise. But Marcus didn't block or dodge. Instead, he used her own momentum, effortlessly redirecting her past him. She stumbled, caught off guard by the simplicity of his move. Chuck appeared beside them, asking Marcus to explain. The boy's response was calm. He hadn't fought force with force, but had used energy to protect them both. Karen straightened as realization hit. She had spent years in law enforcement, believing strength meant control, that force was the answer. Yet here was someone she had once handcuffed, teaching her a lesson in restraint. Chuck nodded, signaling Marcus's turn. As the boy threw his punch, Karen instinctively reached for a wrist lock, a move she had used countless times during arrests. But before she could complete it, Chuck's hand rested on her shoulder, his voice gentle. She was still trying to dominate, not guide. They continued training for hours, and slowly, Karen started to understand. Each time she successfully redirected, a punch without aggression, a deeper truth settled within her. How many moments in her career could have ended differently if she had guided instead of overpowered? As the morning session came to a close, something inside her had begun to shift. Marcus handed Karen a water bottle, his words cutting through the silence. He admitted that when he first came here, he was always angry, just like her. Karen took the bottle, his words hitting deeper than she expected. What had changed? Marcus's answer was simple. Being strong didn't mean proving it all the time. Chuck had taught him that true power was knowing when not to use it. As he walked away, Karen realized that her greatest lesson hadn't come from Chuck, but from a kid she had once dismissed as just another troublemaker. 3 days into training, Karen's world felt completely different. Her muscles ached from unfamiliar movements. But it was the mental shift that unsettled her most. The real challenge wasn't just the techniques. It was the way they forced her to rethink everything she had learned as an officer. That afternoon, Chuck paired her with Sarah Chen, a quiet 16-year-old with sharp eyes. The recognition was immediate. Karen had arrested Sarah's father just last month in a tense confrontation that nearly turned violent. Now she had to take lessons from the girl. Chuck introduced the day's lesson. Fear. Why people caused it, why they felt it, and what it cost them. His eyes met Karen's as he announced that Sarah would lead the exercise. Heat crept up Karen's neck. Taking instructions from a teenager was one thing, but from this particular teenager. She noticed Sarah's hands trembling slightly and recalled the girl's furious screams the day her father was taken away. The exercise was simple. Sarah explained one person would attack and the other had to stand still. No blocking, no dodging. Just feel the fear and let it pass. Karen's disbelief grew as she watched others begin. Students held their ground while their partners' fists stopped inches from their faces. No one flinched. No one moved. Sarah turned to Karen, her voice soft but steady, asking if she was ready. Karen nodded stiffly, unsure of what she was about to face. The first punch came too fast. Karen's instincts took over before she could think. She grabbed Sarah's wrist, spun her around and locked her in a hold. Chuck's sharp command cut through the dojo, bringing everything to a halt. Karen felt the tension in the air as she realized what she had done. Sarah stood trembling in her grip, tears in her eyes. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it hit Karen like a punch, just like you did to my dad. Karen let go immediately, stepping back in shock. What was she doing? She had just restrained a teenage girl in front of everyone. Chuck approached calmly, his voice steady, as he asked why she had reacted that way. Karen hesitated, then spoke the truth before she could stop herself. Fear. She had been afraid, not of Sarah, but of losing control, of feeling vulnerable. The realization settled deep in her chest. Chuck's next words cut even deeper. How many times had that fear guided her actions on the street? How many situations had escalated because she let fear dictate her response? The weight of the question nearly knocked the breath from her. How many people had she hurt because she couldn't handle vulnerability? Chuck turned to Sarah, his voice softer now, asking if she was willing to try again. Sarah wiped her tears and nodded. Karen watched in awe as the girl stepped back into position, her resolve unshaken. In that moment, Karen saw something she had missed before: true courage. The kind she had spent years trying to find. Sarah, just 16, stood with more strength than Karen had in her entire career. Sarah asked again, and this time, Karen forced herself to stay still. Each punch that passed inches from her face carried something more than just physical movement. It was a lesson in trust, in courage, in understanding the fine line between power and strength. When it was over, Sarah gave her a small smile. Karen had done well, she said. Her dad would be proud. The words settled deep, more meaningful than she could have imagined. A teenager had just taught her more about law enforcement than all her years on the force ever had. As the afternoon sun stretched across the ranch, Karen watched a new group arrive. Troubled kids from the local youth center. Many of them were familiar, faces she had seen during her patrols. Chuck had asked her to help with their first lesson, but despite everything she had learned, she felt a familiar anxiety creeping in. Then she saw him. Tommy Rodriguez, just 12 years old. She had caught him spraying graffiti last month, and now, as their eyes met, he froze. His body stiffened, and he instinctively stepped behind the others. The fear in his eyes hit Karen harder than any punch she had taken that week. She had seen that look before, countless times. But for the first time, she truly understood what it meant. Chuck's voice was calm beside her as he reminded her that these kids didn't need another person proving how tough the world was. They needed someone who could show them their own strength. Karen nodded, the weight of the moment settling over her. She had spent years trying to scare kids straight, believing it was for their own good. But standing here now, she realized the truth. She hadn't been teaching them respect. She had only been teaching them fear. Chuck gathered the group, his voice steady as he introduced the lesson. Balance. Karen stepped forward, feeling the weight of all eyes on her. She pulled off her GI top, revealing a tank top beneath. As she rolled up her sleeve, the tattoo on her shoulder caught the sunlight. It was more than ink, it was a memorial. A reminder of her brother, lost to gang violence 15 years ago. The same reason she had joined the force. She turned to the kids, her voice clear. This tattoo was why she became a cop. She had believed that if she was tough enough, if she was feared enough, she could stop others from feeling the same pain. Her family had. She locked eyes with Tommy. But she had been wrong. She moved into the stance Chuck had taught her, her body no longer stiff but fluid. Balance, she explained, wasn't about standing your ground no matter what. It was about knowing when to hold firm and when to adapt. To her surprise, Tommy raised his hand. Like skateboarding? He asked hesitantly. You have to lean into the turn, or you wipe out. Karen smiled, remembering the skateboard she had once confiscated from him. Exactly like that. Want to try? For the next hour, she worked with the kids, guiding them through the same techniques she had struggled with just days ago. But something was different. It wasn't just about movements, it was about trust, about connection. And for the first time, Karen wasn't just teaching. She was learning, help people. To stop what happened to him from happening to anyone else. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I thought fear kept people in line. I thought control meant power. But today, a kid made me realize I was wrong. Chuck took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the words settle in the night air. You weren't wrong about wanting to help, he said finally. Just about how to do it. Karen exhaled, watching the steam rise from her cup. Tommy's words still echoed in her mind. Maybe you could teach us the right way now. It was such a simple request, but it had unraveled something deep within her. She looked up at the stars, feeling lighter than she had in years. The weight of her past, of her anger, of her misguided need for control, it was still there, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. She turned to Chuck. I think I want to stay a little longer. Chuck simply nodded, as if he had expected this all along. Good, he said. There's still a lot to learn. And for the first time in her career, Karen Mitchell was ready. Karen stared at the badge in her hands, the weight of it suddenly feeling different. For years, it had been a shield, something she used to separate herself from the people she was meant to protect. But now, as the last light of day reflected off its surface, she saw it for what it truly was. A responsibility, not a weapon. Chuck's words lingered in her mind. Fear only teaches more fear. She had lived by that fear for so long, believing it made her stronger. But strength wasn't about control. It was about guidance. It was about trust. She looked toward the pond, where the leaf still floated peacefully, undisturbed. Tommy had understood balance instinctively, just like the kids at the ranch. They didn't need force. They needed someone to show them another way. For the first time in years, Karen felt something shift deep inside her. The anger, the guilt, the constant need to prove herself, it wasn't gone, but it no longer defined her. She wiped her eyes and let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The week was almost over, but as she sat beneath the endless Texas sky, she knew Chuck was right. Her real training was just beginning. Month. The old Karen Mitchell would have immediately stepped in, using her presence, her badge, and her authority to break it up. But today, she paused. Kevin stood tense, fists clenched, his opponent mirroring his stance. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, waiting for the fight to explode. Mitchell took a deep breath and walked forward, not with force, but with understanding. She stopped just short of the circle, making no move to grab her radio or call for backup. "Kevin," she said, her voice steady but calm. His head snapped toward her, surprise flickering in his eyes. She saw more than just anger in his stance. She saw fear, frustration, the same emotions that had once driven Marcus. "You don't have to do this," she said, watching the tension in his shoulders. "There's another way." Kevin hesitated. His opponent shifted uncomfortably, the energy of the fight beginning to change. The crowd murmured, some already losing interest. Mitchell took a slow step closer. Marcus learned it. "You can too," Kevin swallowed hard, then exhaled. Slowly, he lowered his fists. His opponent did the same, looking relieved rather than disappointed. The fight was over before it ever started. Mitchell gave Kevin a nod before stepping back, letting him make his own choice about what happened next. And as the crowd dispersed, she realized something. This was the real power she had been searching for all along. Not fear, not control, guidance. And for the first time in her career, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be crowed. The tension that had gripped the parking lot slowly melted away as Kevin exhaled and turned toward his opponent, offering a nod instead of a punch. His rival hesitated, then gave a small, uncertain nod back. Mitchell scanned the faces around her, some disappointed at the lack of a fight, others thoughtful, considering what had just happened. This was the moment that truly mattered, the moment where violence could be replaced with understanding. Kevin stepped toward her, his voice low but steady. "Marcus was right about you," he said. "You're different now." Mitchell smiled slightly, her badge feeling lighter than it ever had. "Maybe I'm finally getting it right." As the crowd dispersed, she stood tall, watching the city she had once tried to control with force. Now she understood. True strength wasn't about dominance. It was about knowing when to stand firm and when to step back. And for the first time, she felt she wasn't just enforcing the law, she was making a difference. Mitchell watched as the crowd slowly dispersed, not out of fear, but from understanding. The tension faded without a single act of violence. Kevin's opponent stepped back, realizing there was no need for a fight. Mitchell caught her reflection in a nearby window, not as a fighter, but as a guardian, someone who stood not to enforce, but to protect. Kevin exhaled, scuffing his shoe against the pavement. "I almost forgot what Sensei Chuck taught us," he murmured. Mitchell gave a small smile, remembering her own lessons. "We're all still learning, Kevin. Every single day." 6 months had passed since her transformation at the ranch, and as Mitchell pulled into Chuck's gravel driveway, she felt a familiar sense of belonging. But this time, she wasn't alone. In the passenger seat sat Jason Torres, a 16-year-old she had caught breaking into cars. Instead of turning him in, she had offered him something else, the same opportunity that had once been given to her. Jason looked uneasy, his eyes scanning the practice yard where students moved through their forms. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. Mitchell's voice was steady. "As sure as Chuck was about me." She led him toward the porch where Chuck stood waiting, his wise eyes crinkling with approval above his beard. "Welcome back, Karen," he said, glancing at Jason. "I see you brought a new student. Learning to guide, I see." Instead of making an arrest, Mitchell had chosen a different path, one she had learned from Chuck. A year after that fateful traffic stop, she now stood before a mixed crowd of police cadets and troubled teens at the ranch. The old walls that once divided law enforcement and the community no longer existed in this sacred space. She watched as Chuck demonstrated a technique, remembering how her own journey had begun with resistance, but had ended in revelation. "True strength isn't about how much power you have," she told the audience. "It's about how you choose to use it. Every interaction is a chance to lift someone up instead of tearing them down." In the back row, Jason Torres sat next to a rookie officer, both now students, both learning the same lessons of respect, responsibility, and redemption. Chuck met Mitchell's gaze, nodding with approval. The silent acknowledgement washed over her like the warmth of the Texas sunset. The mistake that had once threatened to end her career had instead reshaped it, sending ripples of change through the community. Mitchell had become what Chuck had seen in her all along. Not just an officer, but a guardian of hope. She was proof that the path from force to wisdom was possible, showing others the way just as it had once been shown to her.